The morning everything changed, Evelyn Hargrove stepped out of her black Bentley, looked up at the faded Callaway sign, and scoffed. Not a loud laugh, just a quiet, dismissive snicker. The arrogant kind of noise that slips past expensive lipstick without a thought. A sound reserved strictly for those standing closest to her. Her corporate assistants heard it. Her chauffeur did too. Her managers quickly looked away. That was the standard protocol whenever their CEO saw something she deemed completely beneath her. She had absolutely no clue that the quiet mechanic inside, the guy wiping grease from his hands behind a heavy steel workbench, actually owned 7 industrial patents that her own factories relied on every single day. She never realized the quiet garage did not mean he lacked a massive ambition. It was the intense focus of a builder who already knew how to win the market. She had just made the most expensive mistake of her whole corporate career, and the wild part is, she kept smiling while entering his shop. Today, you and I will unpack how this overlooked father quietly took over her empire. Because every detail matters for how he turned the tables. His small shop sat in a gritty industrial zone inside a mid-sized city that had been struggling to grow for 20 years. The old brick building was narrow. Outside, the gray paint was peeling, and his sign was rusting at the corners, making the business look much older than it really was. But on the inside, everything was different. Every wrench and socket hung on a pegboard, outlined in marker so nothing ever ended up on the wrong hook. The steel benches were entirely spotless except for his active repair job. He swept the concrete floor clean every single morning before the first customer ever showed up, even on days he expected nobody. This level of discipline showed exactly who he was, though superficial clients like Evelyn never bothered to truly look at him. Mason Callaway was 39 years old. He had operated this small garage for almost 4 years, ever since a lease on a massive facility ended and he made a quiet decision to scale down, realizing it was exactly what his family needed. He was raising a 6-year-old daughter named Bonnie. She was missing her front tooth. And she absolutely loved a stuffed bunny named Cotton, who sat on his workbench keeping him company while she was at school. He walked her to the neighbor's place every morning at 7:45 and picked her up at 5 sharp. During those hours, he focused. Here is the secret you and I can see, but the local businesses completely missed. You would never find this information on a cheap business card. Before this, he spent 11 years as the lead systems engineer at the massive Vantex Engineering Group, one of the most respected industrial automation firms on the East Coast. He designed complex automation systems for manufacturing plants across 7 states. He secured 7 individual patents, fully owned by him due to a brilliant employment contract he negotiated. Every single design focused on precision automation and keeping heavy factory machinery running smoothly. 3 of his systems were licensed to major manufacturers, bringing in steady income through their patent division. The quarterly royalty checks were modest, but they made his simple life completely secure. He did not leave his engineering career because the industry was struggling. No corporate boss fired him. It happened because his wife Claire, sadly, passed away suddenly when their daughter was 18 months old, leaving him to raise her alone. He stepped back to focus on his daughter, applying the same precision he used to change the industry. He never publicly mourned his past career. He kept his old corporate life quiet, and nobody in town bothered to ask. Only his old college buddy Adrian Cole, running an investment fund across town, paid attention. Adrian checked in on him constantly. Mason always offered the exact same quiet deflection. A simple shake of his head, eyes dropping straight back to his tools. Adrian knew the quiet single dad would only open up when he was ready. Yet his reputation silently stayed alive across the industrial sector, even though his name never appeared anywhere. He simply fixed the broken hardware that stumped everyone else. Word of mouth traveled slowly from one desperate plant manager to another. From shift foreman to maintenance supervisor, the quiet advice was always identical. You and I know how it goes. If the machinery dies and everyone fails, call Callaway Repair. He ran 0 ads. His online presence was just a blank page with a single phone number. His rates were always fair, and he never missed a deadline. While arrogant executives slept, this single father sat in his quiet kitchen every night, drinking black coffee and studying the complex technical manuals he needed to conquer next. He sharpened his engineering skills with the same ruthless discipline he applied to his workshop. He was not waiting for a handout, but he was absolutely ready. The single phone call that changed the entire trajectory of everything arrived on a bleak Tuesday morning in early October. That crucial call did not reach his small garage first. It struck Jason Merritt, the arrogant chief financial officer of Hargrove Industrial. He received a frantic alert from their second massive factory just before 7 in the morning. The report was terrifying. Their primary machining production line had completely died overnight. A sudden electrical fault fried the control boards, leaving their expensive system completely paralyzed. Their highly paid corporate engineers spent 3 hours completely failing to find the root cause. Hargrove Industrial dominated the precision metal component market. They were the third largest manufacturing operation in the Northeast by revenue, and their second facility was currently under strict contract to deliver critical parts to a military buyer in exactly 48 hours. Jason desperately dialed 2 major repair firms before 8 in the morning, getting the same useless answer. Their elite teams could not arrive for another 72 hours. He rang the manufacturer's emergency support line only to be left stranded on hold. Sweating, he dialed corporate CEO Evelyn Hargrove at 8:20 and explained the disaster to her with the cautious phrasing of an executive who had long ago mastered the corporate art of sugarcoating disasters to save his skin. The powerful CEO coldly listened, snapped "Fix it by noon," and hung up. Panicking, Jason called right back to the factory manager who first reported the outage. A grizzled veteran named Walt Garber, who had run that factory floor for 22 years. Walt met the executive screaming panic with an unshakable, deadpan Midwestern calm. "Stick with me here." Walt admitted he knew one quiet underdog who could help, promising nothing. He warned that this genius operated a tiny shop and might just ignore their desperate plea. The panicked executive demanded the phone number anyway. Walt handed over the number, sharing one final detail before hanging up. "You and I love this part. This quiet underdog once fixed a system failure in 4 minutes that corporate teams spent 2 days hopelessly botching." Jason Merritt scribbled the mechanic's number down, highly doubtful, and made the call. The ignored genius answered on ring 3. He was working at his small bench. The call took exactly 4 minutes. Mason calmly asked which control board model was failing, and the overnight warehouse temperature. He also wanted to know if the error codes flashed in order or all together. Jason gave him the details. The quiet mechanic went dead silent for a few moments. It was the quiet pause of a true mastermind, processing complex calculations in his head instead of doubting himself. Then the future market leader agreed to help, asking for their location. He did not even mention pricing, and a stress Jason forgot to ask. Mason hung up, putting his cheap phone face down on the wooden table. He packed his tools with the calm focus of a guy who already knew how to solve their massive crisis. He left some cotton on the bench for Bonnie and taped a quick note to the door. He drove his rusty 11-year-old truck across town, arriving at the giant Hargrove plant at 9:40. The corporate headquarters was massive and spotless, surrounded by fancy leased vehicles that cost far more than his entire small repair garage. A group of highly paid executives stood waiting in the parking lot near the entrance. As he pulled in, the arrogant CEO Evelyn Hargrove stood waiting in an expensive coat, holding her phone. She shielded her eyes from the sun, glaring at the beat-up truck rolling toward her. Mason calmly climbed out. He wore simple dark work pants, a gray flannel shirt rolled to his elbows, and a pair of worn-out work boots. Throwing a heavy tool bag over his shoulder, he quietly examined the giant building and the gathered suits. You and I know how she looked at him, like he was just a piece of useless, misdelivered junk. She paused, adjusted her stance, and sank into a smug feeling of absolute corporate condescension toward him. Her anxious assistant, Cara Whitfield, stood 2 paces behind the CEO, remaining completely silent. The ignored genius offered a polite nod to the executives. No one returned the nod. He just followed Walt Garber inside. For over 2 hours, only Walt and 2 techs stayed behind. They had orders to watch closely, thinking this small-town mechanic would definitely need their help. He did not need help. He systematically disassembled the control cabinet, completely calm with absolute razor-sharp focus. He remained completely quiet except once, just to ask for a specific cable, which Walt quickly retrieved from a nearby cabinet. He never even opened the manuals. Walt was amazed knowing this complex 10-year-old proprietary system was a mystery to every outsider. At 11:47, the assembly line roared back. The massive breakdown was simply a minor grounding issue, masking a badly corrupted software boot sequence. Corporate tech support would have wasted 2 days debugging this. The future industry leader solved it instantly. Walt stood right at the edge of the warehouse floor, watching the first parts move through the newly running line, feeling a deep satisfaction. He had witnessed too many massive corporate failures here, and far too few quiet victories like this one. The future giant quietly packed up his tools. He walked out of the production room into the lobby, where the condescending CEO waited with Jason and 2 stressed managers. Of course, she was staring at her phone again. When Mason walked up, she hung up. "How much?" she asked, dismissing him like cheap labor. "You and I know what happened next." Mason silently handed over his bid. Just a fair price, no corporate fluff, no cheap desperation. Evelyn barely glanced up, casually telling Jason to pay him off. Jason watched him with the smug, condescending grin of a corporate suit. A suit who thinks he just dismissed some worthless, small-time repairman. He bragged to the room about how lucky they were to hire cheap labor, mocking how this small local rate saved their massive corporate budget from high-end tech firms. One colleague smirked at the jab, while another quietly stared at the floor. Jason kept talking, bragging about slashing his operational expenses. He sneered the word small business twice in under 30 seconds. Delivering each line with a petty, condescending sneer meant to turn a simple fact into an insult. Evelyn let the disrespect continue. The corporate chief was already ignoring them, scrolling her phone. Kara stood quietly behind her. Her gaze was blank. "You and I know that. Look, the quiet shame of an employee who hates her boss's ego but lacks the power to speak up." Mason refused to take the bait. He didn't look to Evelyn for any validation. He calmly zipped his toolbox, moving with patient, steady purpose, and slung the heavy strap over his shoulder. Evelyn dismissed him with one cold, final glance of ruthless corporate authority. "Thanks for coming out on short notice. If any other tiny little problems happen, we'll let you know." That single word, tiny, lingered heavily in the quiet room. Mason met her gaze. If she realized she was looking at the man who would soon buy her out, she'd have choked. No flash of anger, no desperate need to prove himself. "Stick with me here." He simply analyzed her like a failing machine, charting her company's fatal vulnerabilities without an ounce of malice. He softly murmured a polite goodbye, turned, and walked away. Walt Garber caught up to him at the exit, gripping Mason's hand tightly with both of his calloused palms. He whispered that the intricate system Mason just restored was originally built by elite Vantex engineers 9 years ago. Walt clearly remembered being present on the day it was installed. Since then, he'd never seen anyone service it blind, without consulting a single manual. He couldn't fathom how a local repairman possessed such mastery, but he was profoundly, deeply grateful. Mason simply thanked him, keeping his massive leverage hidden, and stepped outside. He sat silently in his truck cabin for several minutes, the engine completely dead, staring straight through his windshield at the massive, spotless Hargrove headquarters, its gleaming steel emblem glowing brightly right beside the grand glass entrance. His face remained expressionless. His rough hands never flinched. Finally, he reached into the glove box, pulling out a faded manila folder untouched for over 2 years. Inside lay a powerful remnant of his former corporate life. A ruthless acquisition strategy he was once paid a fortune to design, targeting the full vulnerable structure of that exact aging Hargrove facility. "Let's think about this together." He looked at the cover, smirked, stored it away, started his engine, and drove off to pick up his daughter. Later that evening, Adrian arrived with cheap drinks, acting like he had nowhere to be. It was his quiet way of showing he knew a major shift was brewing, and that he was ready to listen whenever Mason wanted to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, plotting once his little girl was fast asleep. Mason laid out his day calmly, completely devoid of ego. A quick repair, a simple payment, and Jason Merritt's arrogant remarks. Adrian listened intently, then asked the very question he had been weighing since Mason started talking. What are you actually planning? Mason admitted he was eyeing the Westbrook facility. Adrian slowly set his drink down. Westbrook was the third major manufacturing plant in the massive Hargrove empire. Arrogant CEOs like Evelyn Hargrove shuttered it 14 months ago, claiming operational failure. It sat abandoned on 12 prime acres right in Westbrook, barely 6 miles away from where these underestimated men now sat. The heavy machinery inside seemed ancient. The building was classic mid-century industrial. The massive property had been listed on the market for 9 months passed without a single buyer, thanks to its reputation as a money pit. Adrian knew the details. The quiet mechanic had mentioned it once before, months ago during a casual talk that seemed entirely unimportant back then. Now, hearing Mason speak with such absolute focus, Adrian realized this overlooked genius was playing the long game. But let us look at what Adrian did not know yet, which Mason soon revealed. He mapped out the assets hidden inside Westbrook, proving the arrogant corporate elites dead wrong. Mason had actually been inside. He walked that facility 5 years ago, back when he consulted for Hargrove. Former executives had commissioned a major rehab study, long before Evelyn took charge. He spent 3 intense days analyzing the facility floors with a small tech team. His detailed report proved 70% of the machinery was highly salvageable, representing a massive hidden production capacity. If upgraded properly, it would easily crush Hargrove's active facilities, drastically slashing their manufacturing costs. That golden blueprint was submitted, received, and, as Mason later discovered, routed straight to the arrogant Jason Merritt to be buried. They completely ignored it, foolishly shutting down the massive facility instead. Mason knew his brilliant blueprint was buried. He followed up once, only to receive a lazy, automated corporate form letter. He never bothered to follow up again. But this overlooked underdog never forgot the massive potential hidden inside those walls. He remembered the precise equipment layouts and the entire dormant system infrastructure. He knew the immense power waiting to be unlocked by someone who actually understood the systems, ready to do the hard engineering. A man who, ironically, designed the very control systems running that heavy industrial machinery. A quiet innovator holding the actual patents. Adrian simply asked how long. Mason promised 18 months from a quiet buyout to full production. Adrian let that massive revelation sink in. You and I know that. Look, he was testing the math against his gut. Then he calmly said he was in, completely ignoring the projected returns. He never questioned the risk. He simply asked when they would begin the legal battle. Mason replied, tomorrow. Their secret weapon was a sharp property attorney named David Keene, a meticulous man operating from a quiet office that smelled of old books, the lawyer who quietly secured Mason's early patent deals. Years ago, Keene took Mason's call the next morning with quiet surprise. Stick with me here. The overlooked father just requested the listing terms for Westbrook. Stick with me here. David promised to verify the details and call back today. 4 hours later, the phone rang. The property was cheaper than Mason expected. Not quite a steal, but cheap enough to swing a massive door wide open. The industrial warehouse had sat ignored long enough that the arrogant corporate board authorized their manager to simply take any decent offer instead of keeping dead weight on their corporate balance sheet, especially with their massive annual audit creeping right around the corner. David confirmed the corporate seller was barely vetting buyers. They simply did not care. Mason gave the green light to draft the offer. That night, he reviewed his startup numbers, calculating every detail 3 separate times. Not because he doubted his engineering skills, but because underdog discipline demanded perfection. Adrian's initial funding covered the property purchase and the early repair work, plus 14 months of cash runway before any real manufacturing revenue rolled in. The budget was razor thin, but never impossible. He had survived on tighter margins his entire career, but the business principles remained exactly the same. You and I know precision beats margin, and quiet patience always outlasts raw speed. He drove out to Westbrook that Thursday afternoon while his daughter was still at school, pulling up in a light rain that stained the abandoned brick a deep, rusty color. The warehouse had sat dark for over a year, its massive dock doors sealed shut with heavy chains and rusted padlocks. But he had secured temporary access through David's real estate agency. He paced the massive factory floor completely alone for 4 solid hours that afternoon, examining every single square inch with the slow, careful focus of a master craftsman reading a language he understood perfectly. He inspected support beams, checked motors, traced electrical conduits and tested manual overrides on the discarded machines. He never bothered taking notes, simply because he did not need them. Every minor detail was already locked inside his mind, the way a true builder stores knowledge for the long haul. Stepping back into the chilly rain, he silently cut his 18-month timeline down to just 15. The old facility had aged beautifully where it mattered most, failing only in spots he could easily repair himself. The corporate acquisition quietly finalized on a peaceful Friday morning. No flashy press releases, zero big announcements. On paper, the buyer was Callaway Industrial LLC, registered just 3 weeks prior with Adrian as partner and Mason as director. The business registry was public record, completely visible to anyone who bothered to look. But those arrogant corporate executives at Hargrove had absolutely no reason to ever check. And the name Callaway, buried deep within a standard property deal, raised zero red flags. Hargrove's arrogant female CEO signed the transfer papers during a brief 30-minute meeting. A meeting she spent entirely glued to her smartphone. The former plant workers who lost their jobs when Westbrook closed were never told about this quiet sale. But as you and I know, industry networks talk fast, completely bypassing corporate public relations. In the weeks after the deal, Mason quietly kicked off his local hiring process, tapping directly into Walt's trusted local network and recruiting from his old Vantex contacts to secure the exact talent his growing operation would ultimately need to win. Look, true underdogs never post their job listings publicly. He called them directly, pitching a real startup vision and a fair, honest wage. Nothing flashy. But money wasn't the hook, it was the raw promise behind his vision. A real chance to build an industrial business from scratch, led by a guy who actually knew the shop floor. Of his first 15 hires, 6 were former Westbrook workers, the very ones Evelyn tossed aside when she closed the plant. They knew every brick, they understood that heavy machinery. Clocking in for day one, they brought a quiet, gritty hunger that Mason instantly recognized and respected. He didn't waste their time with fancy speeches. He just laid out the blueprints, answered them straight, and let them get to work. Seeing those 6 veterans march right back through the doors that had been slammed in their faces, pure justice. Lugging heavy tool bags, wearing the exact same steel toes from before the corporate layoffs. They didn't come back bitter. They came with the cold, hard grit of tradesmen who knew exactly what this second chance meant. Mason felt a swell of pride, then buried it deep. With a massive industrial build ahead, there was no time for warm, fuzzy feelings. While the underdog quietly built. Now stick with me here. Over at Hargrove, the arrogant giant was cracking, and they never saw it coming. A massive military contract they assumed was locked in had suddenly vanished. Official notes explicitly blamed sloppy delivery and highly unreliable supply chains. Then, another major buyer quietly slashed their orders without a word. Evelyn only saw these red flags through Jason's filtered reports. He spun every lost deal as a market blip, completely ignoring the fatal pattern. Meanwhile, the brutal quality control flaws causing all the customer anger had been silently building up across Hargrove's production plants for nearly 2 years. A direct result of skipped maintenance and those reckless labor cuts from Evelyn's shiny corporate restructuring push. Her plan spiked short-term profits but completely gutted their actual survival. A classic corporate blunder that the working class always spots from a mile away. Evelyn knew boardroom math and flashy market strategies, but she knew absolutely nothing about the actual factory floor. Gritty details of assembly quality meant nothing, and the skilled workers who understood those operations had been ruthlessly purged during her endless rounds of corporate performance reviews. A system rewarding spreadsheet talk over real hands-on knowledge. Cara Whitfield was one of the few who saw the rioting foundation long before the profits tanked. For 4 years straight, she served as Evelyn's head executive assistant, a job granting full access to private emails and raw meeting notes. She saw the real client complaints, not the watered-down nonsense Jason handed to the bosses upstairs. 9 months ago, she typed up a sharp, highly careful warning memo. mapping out the dangerous spike in angry buyer feedback and endless machine breakdowns. Evelyn glanced at it, flagged it, and blindly tossed it to Jason for a quick review. Nobody ever replied to Kara, not a single meeting, not one follow-up conversation at all. She simply kept doing her job, kept watching, and kept waiting. And this is where it all connects. While watching, she finally noticed the Callaway industrial name, the overlooked player quietly stealing the future right out from under her arrogant nose. "You and I know my name" meant absolutely nothing back then. She just filed my paperwork, moving quickly on. Over at Westbrook, my overlooked startup quietly began commercial production. 14 months post-buyout, my production line hummed at scale, beating my ambitious schedule by 4 full weeks. Our very first product was an advanced aerospace component requiring incredibly precise machining that fell within a strict tolerance range almost no North American manufacturing facility could hit. Yet I custom-built my entire factory floor to nail it. I merged my deep engineering talent with the unique capabilities of those old Westbrook machines I bought. Every single machine upgraded with my own 2 hands. The quality margin on our very first commercial run beat the standard industry baseline by 15%. Adrian stood there during the entire opening shift, staring at the final quality metrics in stunned silence. Finally, he muttered we would be drowning in more client orders than we could handle within 6 months. I just nodded, already knowing it. Our opening commercial contract arrived from a mid-sized defense firm that, just 14 months prior, belonged to arrogant Hargrove Industrial. They dumped Hargrove after a massive failure, spending the past year limping along with a weak supplier while secretly hunting the industrial market for real talent. A mutual industry contact quietly passed them a short technical overview covering my new Callaway factory. They immediately ordered a small test run, and we delivered right on time, blowing their strictest internal quality benchmarks completely out of the water. They rapidly fired over a formal contract inquiry. My lawyers checked the terms, tweaked 2 lines, and I signed it instantly. We never announced the new partnership publicly. You and I know that the manufacturing deals that truly shift power are rarely publicized. By the 16th month, however, we held 3 active deals, quietly negotiating a 4th massive contract with a major Japanese auto brand that was desperately hunting a North American partner who could actually hit their demanding dimensional standards. Our talks with their executives had been quietly started by a broker and handled with the extreme patience of 2 serious sides knowing a solid long-term agreement was worth the wait. Once signed, its yearly value eclipsed the mighty Hargrove Industrial's total revenue from their entire previous quarter. Our market breakthrough appeared in a niche trade magazine via one tiny paragraph, simply naming Callaway Industrial, calling us just an emerging precision parts maker operating out of Westbrook. No photos of the underestimated single dad, 0 backstory on how I built it. Just a simple shop name, a small town, and the staggering number. Arrogant CEO Jason Merritt read that tiny paragraph, feeling a sudden icy chill fill his massive office that had absolutely 0 to do with the building's air conditioning. He frantically ran a transaction search on Callaway, uncovering the little property deed for my supposedly worthless Westbrook shop buyout. He just sat there, staring blankly at his screen. He calculated my potential production capacity, using the known machinery they had left behind. Setup, and you and I know what an overlooked underdog builds. What I built once I got proper investment. I knew that realization hit Jason like a rock. Sure, the cheap price he authorized for my property was technically legal. But those pennies were nothing compared to the empire I was secretly building. I bet he slammed his browser shut, unable to look anymore. And he definitely didn't warn his arrogant CEO, Evelyn. But her assistant, Kara, dug deeper and saw my corporate takeover coming clearly. Let's follow her trail as she searched my startup next to our sale date. She found the public records listing me, Mason Callaway, as director. She paused, then typed my underestimated name alongside my old firm, Vantex. The cold, hard facts that popped up weren't some sudden, unpredictable shock to her. They just showed a massive corporate blind spot they should have seen coming. That brutal realization of a fatal mistake. I held 7 patents, plus 11 years of systems engineering for major giants like Hargrove Industrial. She printed the proof, stacking it with my old property records, and put my entire takeover timeline into one folder. She stared at it, then grabbed a pen and wrote my name right on the tab. Perfectly clear. She bypassed Jason completely. After years of watching him bury mistakes, she knew how he hid truths from their CEO. My startup's true threat level required a completely different route. She waited for the right moment to hand it to Evelyn directly. That chance came late Thursday, during their usual end-of-quarter grind at the office. Evelyn was busy dissecting market reports at the table, while Kara sorted through mail nearby. Without saying a word, she dropped my file right next to Evelyn's glass. The powerful CEO looked up, stared at the file, and flipped it open. She scanned the first page slowly, then the second, then my patent list. Then her eyes locked onto the photo on that first page. A professional headshot from my old Vantex profile 6 years ago. I was staring right down the lens in a dark jacket, confident, real, without any corporate pretense. She instantly recognized my face and posture. She recognized that calm, quiet, confident stillness. The single dad who walked into her office with a beat-up tool bag. The guy who fixed her broken assembly line after her expensive experts failed. The nobody she looked down on. She shut my folder, sitting completely frozen in her chair. "You and I know what happened next," she asked when that Westbrook deal closed. Kara gave the date, and Evelyn didn't say another word all night. The brutal audit that followed was her sudden quiet move, made without any warning, telling the board it was just a standard operational checkup. Kara helped run that investigation, giving herself complete backstage access to the entire sloppy paper trail from when Jason practically gave away my Westbrook property. And that trail was absolutely filthy. The lowball price Jason sold to his board had no real appraisal. They got completely outsmarted by the underdog. You and I know what happens when corporate arrogance ignores warning signs. The due diligence file was incredibly thin, and one section was completely ignored. The buyer background check was left totally blank. Not a single person verified it. A major failure in process made worse by a hidden report. The cover-up was worse because it was an active, deliberate lie. The audit team slammed a brutal report on the desk. Its findings were completely undeniable. Jason Merritt quickly handed in his resignation letter 4 days before the board saw those devastating results. He slipped it in quietly, muttering some weak excuse about chasing other opportunities. Evelyn accepted his exit in silence. She sat completely alone in the massive boardroom after everyone else cleared out. The giant west window stared across the city, toward Westbrook, where Mason's small ignored shop sat hidden from this height. She pulled Kara's file from her luxury briefcase and dropped it onto the table. She had reread those pages 3 times since Thursday night. Not for data, but to face a truth that giants always hate admitting. You see, she had to rethink everything about the single dad she once dismissed, whose tiny bill she had paid without looking up, whose market disruptive potential she had dismissed as completely insignificant and forgotten until the industry realized this quiet outsider owned the future. She tracked down Mason's private phone number through David Keene. One quick call did it. Mason was never hiding from the industry. He just had not been invited to the table yet. Evelyn introduced herself. A quiet pause followed, the sound of a patient underdog deciding how to handle a humbled executive, not whether to talk. He simply said, "Hello." Swallowing her pride, the executive asked to meet about a major supply deal. He offered Tuesday morning. Desperate, she let him choose the meeting spot. He chose his small repair shop. She promised to arrive by 9 in the morning. Evelyn showed up completely alone. No driver, no assistants, and no corporate backup. She had never stepped inside his shop since the day she looked down on him. But now she saw this small garage through a completely different lens. She saw perfect tool racks, spotless benches, and a framed photo hanging proudly. A team of brilliant engineers smiling outside their first real production plant. 10 years younger, Mason stood quietly on the left, overlooked even then. Right on the main workbench sat a tiny stuffed bunny with button eyes. One of its soft ears was completely worn out. Evelyn stared at the toy, then quickly looked away. After years of commanding massive boardrooms, standing in this modest shop shocked her. The sheer grit and honesty of this small garage instantly made her slick corporate vocabulary feel entirely useless against real innovation. Mason walked through the back door holding 2 warm mugs. He set one down, sitting quietly on a stool across the heavy wooden workbench. She held the mug tightly, ready to admit what she had to say, confessing that she finally saw the brilliant industry leader she had once dismissed. So here we are, the corporate giant begging the overlooked master for a lifeline. Mason silently analyzed every word of her aggressive corporate pitch. Once she finished, he calmly thanked her for the honesty. Then came his response, no bitter resentment, no anger, just cold, undeniable reality. "Do you remember that afternoon at Facility 2? She just stared. He made it clear he never expected an apology. The past was done, and he had not lost 1 minute of sleep over it. But she needed to know that his grit was genuine, his shop was real, and his pride remained entirely unbroken. She matched his stare. No empty, cheap apologies to quickly escape the heavy silence stretching between them. She simply admitted she finally understood. It was not a confession, but it felt like something far more valuable to a rising player. "You and I can see it was real respect, finally earned by the man she once ignored." Pushing a contract over his grease-stained desk, she watched him look at it without opening it. She said, "Take whatever time you need to review the terms." He calmly promised he would. Standing to leave, she grabbed her expensive designer coat from the dusty metal stool. Pausing near the exit, she turned around to stare at his worn, aging shop sign. The faded, hand-painted logo she once openly mocked was the very brand now dictating their corporate future. No one was laughing now. That sign represented an undeniable new force in the market. It carried the name of a major innovator and his operation, solid and growing. That evening, his buddy Adrian found him looking over the new corporate proposal, studying every single major term. He gave this deal the sharp focus of a leader who knows his value. Adrian set a warm coffee down, asking what was keeping him so focused. Mason quietly explained that Hargrove wanted a manufacturing partnership. Adrian went quiet. After a tense beat, he asked, "Are you going to do it?" Mason simply replied he was thinking about it. Adrian shook his head. "3 months ago, that would have been a wild thing for you to say." Mason turned the page and answered, "3 months ago, I wasn't ready to ask if she was even worth working with. Now I am. That's totally different." Adrian sipped his coffee in silence, realizing the industry balance had officially flipped in their favor. 3 weeks later, the deal was official. Not out of desperation, but because Callaway Industrial now had the leverage to scale on its own terms. He signed because the partnership made strategic sense, the value was clear, and most importantly, as he told his attorney David Keene during the final review, good work ought to go where it can do the most. David stared at him over his reading glasses. He remarked that it was an incredibly rare perspective for a major business deal. Mason smiled. "You and I know those unconventional choices are exactly how tomorrow's giants are built." On Saturday, the original rusty garage sign finally came down. Mason climbed the ladder himself, unbolting the relics of his humble beginnings, while his young daughter Bonnie watched from below, holding their dog tightly. With the old metal gone, she looked up and asked what the new sign would say. He slowly stepped off the ladder. He stood beside her, looking at the empty brick wall where his empire first took root. He firmly replied, "Just Callaway." She nodded. It was the quiet beginning of a massive corporate dynasty, built by a man everyone once overlooked. The new shop sign went up that afternoon. Clean, simple, and completely unassuming. Just his last name in dark letters. No fancy corporate titles, it was enough. You see, it just took the industry some time to finally read it right. Especially in a market where arrogant corporate giants judge you purely by appearances. This local mechanic's rise to the top was never going to be loud. No flashy interviews, no glossy headshots. He skipped the fake success stories that big corporate executives love to post. The trade journals only mentioned his engineering firm when massive contracts forced them to. Only a small handful of people knew the true scale of the quiet market takeover brewing right inside his small repair shop. But let's look closer, in an industry where patience and silent execution decide who survives. This overlooked single father quietly built an operation that would keep running long after those arrogant corporate names at Hargrove were completely replaced. He dominated without bragging or seeking revenge against the people who despised him. He conquered the market the exact same way he fixed a broken engine. Quietly, flawlessly, and completely. Remember this, when the job was done, he just went home to his daughter,